Hi, I'm Jeff Flimlin, Professor Emeritus from Rutgers Cooperative Extension. This is part of the ATEC ACES program, the Algae Culture Extension short course. And today we're in South Portland, Maine, talking with Tollef Olson. And we're going to get some of his background and his feelings on culture of seaweeds and processing and where the industry was and where the industry is going. Tollef, thanks for having us here.
Thanks, Jeff. You're very welcome.
Tell me a little bit about how you got going in the whole seaweed area and what did you do before seaweeds and how did you get into it?
Well, I've got a very diverse background. I've got a very strong commercial fishing background. I've been involved in fisheries from Maine to Florida to training countries down in Central and South America. I also have a strong food background, and I did marine salvage worldwide for a long time, which allowed me to learn more culture about food and seaweeds and things like that. Combining the three, I have the perfect skill set for what I'm doing.
Okay. Having had a background in food processing myself, I know how that translates over into fisheries, and it's always a good thing. So how did you actually, you were with Bangs Island Mussel Farm, and was that part of the beginning of seeing seaweed as a potential?
Well, I saw the seaweed as a potential way back in 81 or 82. I had a restaurant up on Mount Desert Island and actually discussed it with Shep Earhart, the founder of Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. Right. And it was way too early for seaweed farming and the new product line development. I moved back to Maine in 93. I'm a native and started in the urchin industry, and I'm watching one more fishery go boom and bust. Time to start growing our own. Very interested in growing seaweed, but the market still wasn't really there, so I founded Bangs Island Mussels in 97, 98, and was growing mussels on ropes under rafts, one of the first companies that was doing that specifically here in Maine, and started experimenting with my seaweed. At the turn of the century, I saw the demand increasing and the general population acceptance of new products really changing. At first, seaweed was seaweed salad in a sushi bar, and it was nori wraps, and that was it. The demographics started evolving, so in the early 2000s, I started experimenting with some fresh frozen cut lines of seaweed and saw some great response. In 2005, 2006, I founded a company called Ocean Approved and introduced the first, as far as I know, line of frozen seaweed products. And so instead of the dried, which are great products, but not everybody in this country is comfortable with, it was an easier medium for them to deal with.
Yeah, that's good. Having different kinds of value-added products always expands the whole marketability of even starting with the same thing.
Absolutely. And then, as we started seriously moving it into farming from wild, I actually was the majority owner of Ocean Approved when we started the first farm in the U.S. in 2009, 2010, and wrote the manual on seaweed farming. We're really starting to see it evolve, but we saw that the seaweed from the farms was a little different than the seaweed from the wild.
So you're actually, when you do processing for the company now, you're purchasing some wild harvest,
yes, and
cultured product too.
Absolutely. We're harvesting ourselves, farming ourselves, and we do purchase also.
Okay. So that's a little bit similar to what's going on with Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. They're mainly wild stuff, but they're getting more and more cultured in as a too. So you're balancing out each other a little bit.
Well, we are. And what we're at Ocean's Balance, we're focused also on new product lines, but also what I call non-traditional seaweeds, kelps, and some of the reds and greens. And I'm looking for more year-round availability of the biomass. The original crops we started with are what people are familiar with, the laminarias, but they have a strict seasonality to them.
Yeah.
And so now we're looking at expanding that.
So I think that's good, because when we've been talking with other growers, we see this thing about, well, this is a potential for people who are in the lobster industry. Once they pull their traps, they can set some lines out for the winter, have something to do, get a harvest in the spring as the traps are going back in, so the two industries are not banging into each other. But now taking it to a next level, this could be a year-round occupation for someone.
Absolutely, which makes it twofold. There's what's going on now with the lobster industry and our relationship there is absolutely perfect with the laminarias. We plant them in September, October. We take them out generally in May, maybe into June or April even. And that dovetails so nicely with the lobster industry, but there are a lot of people who can't get into the lobster industry, or even lobster fishermen who have family members who would like to utilize the boats more year-round, or people who just can't get into the industry, period. So by having a crop that you could harvest year-round, it opens up a whole new door and revenue stream.
Seaweed as a food source has been popular in the Canadian Maritimes for a long time. Dulse is a snack. They drink it with a beer, have it with a beer, etc. it comes down a little bit into Maine, but it's never this whole thing is never percolated further south. Do you have any feelings of why it's
Absolutely.
more a northern thing?
Think about the United States, our geographic location and size. We had all the farmland, all the ranch land, and we had Georges Bank and miles, thousands of miles of coastline with all the primary fish. If you look at any other society, Japan, China, Europe, they had to go to secondary and tertiary food sources long before we did here in the U.S. Well, people are finally waking up. Our food model's broken, and seaweed might not be the silver bullet, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you think of the current kelp farming renaissance? Or maybe it's not a renaissance, maybe it's a real start, but how do you feel about what's going on now in New England?
I absolutely love it. As far as I know, I started the first kelp farm in the U.S. for food, and the whole idea has been for the socioeconomic benefits to migrate to our coastal communities. We have so many outlying coastal communities, whether it be for the fisheries or for the people who aren't in the fisheries, that we need opportunity. We need jobs. We also need farms that will be here in the 21st or 22nd century, and the model we have now is broken.
You know, you bring an interesting point about jobs, because this happens all around. Even up in Belfast, there are jobs that go wanting. There's a factory up there that has 72 jobs that are unfilled, and yet a lot of people don't even have the skills to go into some of these things. Now, with this kind of work on the water, guys who work on the water with their family as a lobsterman, they know how to tie knots, they know how to put out an anchor, they know how to do these things, so they've got some of that skill set already. Is there any basic skills that someone needs aside from knowing how to handle a boat and, you know, tie lines and set out an anchor that they need to do for kelp farming?
Well, it's basically the biggest deal is safety. And the wintertime boating, it's one thing to take a safe boating course and boat here for a couple months in the summertime. You have to be prepared to be out there in January and February, and if you aren't, you shouldn't even consider this industry.
Right, okay. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because you get a wind will come up or a storm comes up and you don't want to be there.
It starts before you even get on the water. Try to put a boat down a boat ramp when it's a sheet of ice.
Yeah. And not have the pickup go with it. So you think there's a potential for more people getting into the production side. What kind of caveats would you have for those people trying to start in farming? What do they need to think about first before they say, I'm going to just go do this?
Well, the first thing is any entrepreneur has to realize that they're leaving what in this country we're used to as kind of a safety net. You have a 5-day-a-week job, 40 hours a week, and there's a paycheck that shows up. Guess what? That first paycheck is going to be later than you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
So be prepared.
Right. So someone needs to have a little bit of money in their pocket, and we're going to talk a little more later about how these lines get set up. But what do you think for when someone starts out? I've dealt a lot with hard clam growers, and I always tell them, buy the largest seed you can get. Just grow a little bit the first year or so you see what your site is like, and then expand with no more than you would lose at the casinos in Atlantic City, okay?
That's actually good advice.
It is good. So if someone wants to start, what do you think an appropriate amount of money they would need to have, or if it's used gear, how much used gear could they get away with to start to say, I'm learning how to do this, and it's given me a good enough experience that I can expand at some point? Well,
let's just assume that they don't have to buy the infrastructure, the boat, et cetera.
Right.
The LPAs that Maine does now, the Department of Marine Research, it's a limited purpose aquaculture lease. When they first wrote that law, it didn't include seaweed. I actually sat down with Larice Churchill, who's still up there, and John Lewis, who's still the head science officer, and helped them write into the LPA laws seaweed. And where I'm going with this right now, anybody in the state can get LPAs as long as they choose their sites carefully, and you're allowed as a person up to 4, and intermingling you can have more than that. So the advice would be to start with 4 LPAs. They'll be 400 feet long. Site selection is key to everything.
Right.
We could go into that more. And a 400-foot line using the new mooring systems that I've designed really only run about $800 for the actual physical parts. So if you're going to put in 4 LPAs, you need seed, you need money for being on the water. You could really start a seaweed business with as little as $5,000 if you can free up the time and access the boat.
Right, okay. So that's a good place to start. You mentioned the LPAs. How difficult is it to get an LPA or a regular lease in Maine?
It's so funny because there's never black and white. It really comes down to site selection, knowing your neighborhood, and also knowing where it's going to grow. It doesn't grow just any place. You can go, hey, there's nobody doing anything over there, but do you know that's going to grow good seaweed? Right. I've done a lot. I've probably put in more individual sites than any other kelp farmer in Maine, and I've seen really drastic differences in the growth in different areas.
All right, so this is a good point. When we do hard clam culture or oyster culture, it's not necessarily always in a place where hard clams or oysters grow,
Yes.
right? It's in a place, for some reason, they don't settle there. But there's good water flow and enough nutrients that those things will grow there. If you're looking for a place to grow seaweed, do you look for a place where seaweed's already established, or are we in the same kind of a paradigm where if you got the right water flow, et cetera, it's going to be a good enough spot?
When I first started into aquaculture in the 90s, I spoke with a very knowledgeable individual, and he looked at me and said, Tollef, go find out where they grow well in the wild. With seaweed, that is integral. That said, there's the seaweeds that we're already farming and the seaweeds we're about to farm. And the seaweeds we're working on for the future farming are going to increase that geologic ability by just, it's going to multiply unbelievably. We're going to have so much more area that's suitable to seaweed farming.
Okay, all right, good. So what's your relationship in terms, I know you've been working with University of New England, but you've had a storied career of working with a number of universities in Maine. You can get the litany if you'd like it, but where do you think the university should be partnering, or the state government or federal government, USDA with Regional Aquaculture Center, partnering with industry to get the stumbling blocks you might have now looked at so we can go into further expansion of the industry?
The universities are integral, and I've worked with the University of Rhode Island, the University of Connecticut, the University of New Hampshire, the University of New England, the University of Maine, Maine Maritime, and excuse me if I've left a couple out. And where I'm going to go with this is, as an entrepreneur and as a startup business, there are a lot of things you can't really handle. I mean, you can't afford to set up the lab, say.
Right.
And so the first thing that we dealt with was seed technology, and we actually worked with Professor Yarish down at the University of Connecticut under a NOAA SBIR grant, and that's how we developed that handbook.
Okay. So where now, if you were king, where would you say, well, the stumbling block that we have now is this, and we would need to, are there stumbling blocks in kelp farming, or do you think that the need is in developing species to use?
I think developing species is a huge component of it. But what I want to see right now from the universities is a food label that makes sense for seaweed. Our food labels are designed for terrestrial foods, and seaweed is not. Like, we have to label our potassium as sodium chloride on the label. That makes no sense whatsoever.
No.
Sodium chloride, blood pressure.
Right.
Potassium chloride, blood pressure.
Right.
Makes no sense. And there are many other things. The way that the USDA labels food now does not really tell the story of seaweeds.
Okay. What do you, I mean, this has become an interesting topic. You're bringing out the food aspect of it. What should people be thinking about of why they should consume seaweeds? And because it's obviously not a center of the plate dish.
No, but
for most of the time.
But what we need to do is emulate the Asiatic diet, and that is putting in a little bit of it in everything. 50% of the people in this country are iodine deficient. Guess where the best source of iodine is? 90% are magnesium deficient. Guess for a great source of that. Kelp has, I used to say a couple dozen trace elements and minerals. My doctor laughed and said, Tollef, it has all of them. 50 or 60 trace elements and minerals you can't afford to put them in fertilizer to get them into a land crop.
Right. How often do you consume seaweeds in some form or another?
2 or 3 times a day is not unusual.
Really?
You can put a little bit in the mayonnaise in a fried egg sandwich.
Oh,
you can sprinkle a little bit on your poached eggs. You can have it in your smoothie. You can put it in your white clam sauce at dinner at night. If you go to our website at Ocean's Balance, you'll be amazed at the diversity of food items we put it into.
I noticed the recipes and things on there.
Did you see the fudge?
Oh, yeah, no, it's amazing.
You got to see what happens at the shows when we put that on the table.
I imagine. So what new products are you thinking about down the next couple of years?
Well, right now everything in this state is mostly focused on the browns, at least from the farming aspect. So I want to see the farming move into the reds and the greens, but I also want to see kelp expand also. There's some what I call non-traditional kelps. I won't get any more specific than that right now, but kelps are just large brown algae. It's not really a scientific word. And we have a lot of underutilized species that have longer seasonal availability. And so we're working on the propagation successfully in the lab. But I've been working with Maine Maritime and Uni on the propagation, but we're working now on getting it to go to a substrate so we can transplant it to the ocean.
What advice would you have for someone who says, I want to try this?
That's a good question. I've always said that what I do is a lifestyle and not a job. And so are you really looking for a change of lifestyle, or are you looking for a job? You're going to work hard. Might not have to work 40 hours a week, but you might have to work 100.
Right. So it is very different than a land-based job.
It is. No matter how careful you plan it or where you place your farm, you're working with Mother Nature, and sometimes with, and sometimes almost it feels like against. And you've got to learn to work with her, because you cannot run against the wind.
As we found out. What do you think the potential is for growth of seaweed farming in New England?
Huge, and I think it's actually, I would actually go further than that and say in the United States, because you go south, it's different species. The Hawaiian royalty had seaweed gardens 600, 700, 800 years ago. There are so many benefits to it ecologically, socioeconomically, and health-wise on the food side of things that it's a win-win-win. And the U.S. has finally reached that tipping point that overcrowded places like Japan, China reached centuries ago. And so we have to look to new food sources. And the ocean, 71% of this earth is covered by water.
Yep. What's your favorite seaweed or your favorite seaweed recipe?
That's always a tough one, because I just love it in everything. I have a hard time with that one. I use it in so much and so many different things that I really can't single out one that just goes, yay! Because I'm involved.
Good. Thanks for watching. We're going to do another segment with Tollef on how to set up the main lines for the seaweed culture.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Appreciate it.